I want to extend my welcome to everyone out there. As Christy said, I'm Jason Dawsey from the National World War II Museum's Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. I'm just delighted that we actually have a chance today to have a conversation about baseball and World War II with author Keene. And just to say a little bit about Anne before we get started, she is a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill School of Journalism. She's worked as a speechwriter on Capitol Hill, and her work has appeared in various places, including the New York Times, the Dallas Morning News, and the Raleigh News and Observer. But we're here today to talk about Anne's new book, a fascinating book about baseball in World War II, The Cloudbuster 9, the untold story of Ted Williams and the baseball team that helped win World War II. Anne, welcome. It's great to have you with us today. Thanks very much. It's such an interesting book, an interesting story. And I thought I would begin that, every book has a story behind it. Aside from the content, the actual subject matter, there's always a story about how this book came about. And in your case, this book has a very special personal connection for you. And could you start off, get us going by talking about how you got involved and started thinking about doing this project?
Right. Well, I grew up in Hickory, North Carolina. Again, thank you for bringing me on today. And all my life, there was this picture on the wall of my father with Ted Williams and Johnny Pesky. And we knew the story about how he was a bat boy and the mascot for a Navy pre-flight base during World War II, of which his father was a commander. His father had graduated from the Naval Academy and went back in to serve during World War II. But again, we looked at this portrait literally every day of my life. And my father passed away several years ago. He had become a professional baseball player. And when he died, I was asked to write the obituary and deliver the eulogy at the service. And I wanted to honor him with this story. And so if you go to the next slide, I opened a trunk and found more pictures of my father. And again, I wasn't really an expert by any means on baseball, but immediately I knew he was surrounded by major league players. So again, this was in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. In 1943 was when this image was shot. But again, he's with Buddy Hassett, Ted Williams, Johnny Pesky, Don Kepler, the Navy publicist, and John Sane. And of course, during World War II, the Navy, there was the Navy V5 pre-flight training school opened in Chapel Hill. So my dad was the bat boy there for a couple years. And so I told the story at his funeral. And if you'd like to go to the next slide, the result was a book entitled The Cloudbuster 9. And if you look at the cover, my dad, there he is, the bat boy, surrounded mainly by major league players. But that's actually just a small part of the story. Of course, Ted Williams arrived in Chapel Hill in 1943. And as I worked on the book, every person that I interviewed, really, they were just starstruck by Ted Williams. They had an amazing story. So therefore, he was added in the title. I had the opportunity to get to know his daughter, Claudia Williams, who's just an amazing person. But again, it's more than baseball. During World War II, there were 5 Navy pre-flight bases open. And if you'd like to go to the next slide, I'll show you how all this began. Basically, after Pearl Harbor was bombed, there was a pilot shortage. They didn't have aircraft. And one of the main things was training pilots, recruiting them, getting them in shape. And this is actually a picture taken in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. The airport still exists today about a mile away from the campus. But again, the Navy, they created something, it was really a ground school, and it was based on sports. And if you go to the next slide, 2 of the gentlemen who were responsible for creating this program was Captain Arthur Radford, and then Tom Hamilton, lieutenant commander at the time. He was a carrier pilot. He was a famous football player at the Naval Academy, but also a coach. And he eventually became a member of the College Football Hall of Fame. But he was basically tasked to create truly one of the most difficult physical training programs on earth for fighter pilots. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to give you a glimpse into this world. Now, we showed the picture of the airport. There was that Frank Porter Graham was the president of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And he built that airport. And there's that saying in the Field of Dreams, of course, he was Archibald Graham's little brother. And it was build it and he will come. So Chapel Hill, they had a publicity office. And if you go to the next slide, it was like a comic book culture of Navy fighter pilots, who many of whom, like Ted Williams, became Marines. But again, it was just, they had beautiful illustrations. It was all part of recruiting. So again, every base had their own cartoonist on staff. And if you go to the next slide, I'd like to spend a little more time on this one. It really was like a Captain Marvel culture of superheroes of their day. I mean, they actually said, you know, Superman wasn't even tough enough to get through this. It was a 90-day program. And again, if you look very clearly, sports were used for training: baseball, basketball, wrestling, boxing, track, swimming, of course. So if you go to the next slide, the star of the book, if you will, is Ted Williams. And this picture was taken in May of 1942 when he decides to enlist in the Navy V5 program. This is in Boston. Actually, I believe this was a publicity image from the Navy. But again, he was tough. Of course, he went for one of the toughest programs there could be, one of the toughest training paths in the service, with really one of the highest casualty rates. And this was really the beginning in May of 42, of course, a year before he landed in Chapel Hill. But if we go to the next slide, I'll take you into the world of pre-flight. Now, I love this picture. This is obviously Ted Williams with Babe Ruth. They're in the locker room at a very famous war relief game, designed and orchestrated by Babe Ruth himself. This picture is up at the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. But right here, we know that they are talking about the best hitters in baseball, and Ted at the time was training in Chapel Hill. They didn't allow him to leave base very often because they really wanted him rooted there, training behind security posts. So one of the reasons this book was not written until I took a stab at it was because many of these photos, they were either in the archives at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill or here at the Hall of Fame. And, you know, again, they're all over the internet. It's a beautiful image. And to me, it represents everything that World War II and that military service was all about. So again, this was taken at the Yankee Stadium locker room before a famous game, which I'm going to wrap up with. It was the Yankeelands game. So go ahead and to the next slide. Now, this is another famous baseball card. You know, as I've given talks around the country, people, especially in North Carolina, are really intrigued with this. But again, this was actually it was based in Chapel Hill in 1943. And it was when they allowed Ted to leave on those rare occasions where he got to leave base. And I'll note, you know, it was during gas and tire rationing. So, you know, they kept him rooted in Chapel Hill, training just as hard as every other cadet when he was there. So the next slide. Chapel Hill, the way I describe this training base is it was really a Camelot of sports heroes, Olympic athletes. You had famous football players such as Bear Bryant was a coach, Jim Crowley was a coach, Bernie Bierman, Otto Graham was there, I believe, training as a cadet. And then we get to the major league players. Charlie Gehringer went through pre-flight indoctrination training in Chapel Hill, and he was the coach at St. Mary's pre-flight. But we had about 24 major league players come through this very small school during World War II. And I call it, again, a Wheaties culture, you know, because it's funny. You have Olympic athletes across from you, then you've got guys with their faces on the cover of Wheaties cereal boxes. But again, some of the most famous coaches of the sports world volunteered their time to train the Navy pilots. Larry Snyder, Jesse Owens' track coach at OSU, trained pilots. I believe he was at the Iowa campus. Don George, world wrestling champion, was in Chapel Hill. Willie Ternessa was a cadet at Chapel Hill, U.S. amateur golf champion. And then for football, we've got Bud Wilkinson, Jim Crowley, Bernie Bierman, Don Farrow, and of course, Bear Bryant. And then basketball, John Wooden, Frank McGuire. Boxing, Jack Dempsey, Gene Tunney. And if you go to the next slide, this is how they captured a lot of the activity in the training. This is a guy sitting on the hood of the car, and he was the Navy publicist, and he basically captured the cadets in training, again, they got up at 5:30 in the morning. They pretty much spent about 8 or 9 hours out on the fields, and I'm going to show you some pictures of those later. But pictures like this literally were sitting in the archives at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill at Wilson Library for about 75 years. Again, my father died in 2014, and when I went back to the library, there are thousands of images like these. So if you go to the next slide, this just shows you the training culture. They, in addition to the cartoonists that they had on staff, Don Freeman, the illustrator for Corduroy the Bear, was recruited to come and paint the cadets in training. And again, they're beautiful images. And these are up in Washington, D.C., I believe, at the museum at U.S. Navy Yard. So go to the next slide. And when these guys came on base, pre-flight was different. It was kind of like the Boy Scouts. Obviously, it was before the Navy SEALs, but it was really serious, intensive training. And as you'll see here, when guys like Ted Williams shipped into base, he didn't get to room with Johnny Pesky. And that was all part of the design of the Spartan, ultra difficult training culture. They split them up. So they might have one professional baseball players with 3 guys they'd never met before. They may have been academically inclined. They may have been, math nerds, but they were all tough as can be. They could have been golfers, but again, they were all introduced for the first time. There were 4 guys to a room. And of course, this is on the campus at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So the next slide will show you even more. Now, as we can all relate, during COVID, rationing was huge during the war, obviously, and the cadets actually built their own training equipment. People call this a German wheel, but it's for balance. And they soldered literally scrap metal together to create these. And we actually have some films of the cadets rolling through campus. But again, they were super industrious. You'll see another slide next. They dug ditches. This is under Finley Golf Course in Chapel Hill. And I believe George Bush might actually be in this image, but they installed drains. They grew their own vegetables with victory gardens. They made the furniture on the base. They paved roads. So again, they did hard labor in addition to the sports training. So the next slide, there you go, that you see them chopping wood. They spent a lot of time out in the woods, but they built the dugout too for the baseball field. But again, they built a lot of the furniture for the base with the wood. And then again, these guys were in tip-top shape. You had to be. Being a fighter pilot, especially in the Pacific, was one of the very toughest jobs that anyone could ever take on during the war. It was dangerous. And they had to have just a perfect sense of balance, speed, everything to become one with the plane. And so if you look at the physiques, you can see what kind of shape they were in. And they had to learn instrument training. This was actually Tom Hamilton's airplane, and it was parked outside of one of the dorms. So they taught every cadet, including George Bush, who trained there, sat in that cockpit for instrument training.
And I want to just jump in right here. Because you showed these images are incredible. It's like a who's who.
Thank you.
Really of American sports, and they're talking here about this pre-flight training. So just 2 kind of things that tied directly to what your book covers. Could you give our audience a sense about? You mentioned Chapel Hill, about where were many of these other pre-flight schools located, and you've already shown these pictures of these guys. They're doing their training, these activities. You talk in your book about brotherhood. A real kind of brotherhood that grew out of this experience. So if you could say a bit about that brotherhood that grew out of the training.
Well, I'm glad you're actually showing this slide. And it's in front of an ambulance. And I want to stress, this was truly one of the toughest programs for training throughout the war. And a few cadets died. There were broken backs, bloody noses, teeth knocked out, lots of black eyes. But these guys, they had each other's backs. And people like Ted Williams, he was protected by the Navy publicists. They didn't allow reporters in that could beat him up in the press and, say negative things. But it was a brotherhood. And, they bonded with these guys for the rest of their lives. And we have a lot of evidence of that, too, from the letters that children of cadets like Don Kepler, who was the baseball coach, who was also the head survival instructor. Ted Williams wrote him a long letter, wrote the family when he passed away. So you see, again, lots of evidence that it was a deep just truly loyal relationship, you know, again. And a lot of this too was kind of behind the scenes, like based on the letters, based on the conversations that I've had with children of cadets. I know that they communicated either by phone, like Bear Bryant, for example, the football coach, used to call Don Kepler whenever he was up at Penn State. They'd go have coffee, but always behind the scenes in the corner of a little coffee shop. And then he'd go about his way afterwards. But again, it was a sacred brotherhood. And frankly, they didn't talk about it. And that was just the way they were. They didn't talk about the war, but again, they truly felt like they had each other's backs.
It's fascinating.
So I guess we'll go to the next slide. Now, some of the personalities there. My dad always used to tell the story, the call for you know, Philip Morris, little Johnny Morris, the mascot for Big Tobacco. He would come down to campus. And so this is just one of the publicity images there. And he's obviously a famous living mascot from the World War II era. That's why I wanted to point that out. So the next, now some of the personalities that visited campus, as I said, it was like a Wheaties Camelot sports training culture, and Jack Dempsey came through Chapel Hill. Again, there were 5 bases, one in Iowa, one in Georgia, Athens, Georgia, 2 in California, and this was on the Chapel Hill base, and he carried a little pistol, which I always found interesting, but you know, he was just there to pass through, to motivate the cadets. I know Eddie Rickenbacker is another who came. So if you keep flipping through, I'll show you some of the other people. Of course, this is a great picture of Bear Bryant when he was the football coach at Chapel Hill. He also coached basketball, but he also worked down at the Georgia station. And the next one, John Glenn, this was from Iowa. And the boy next to him, he had the same job that my dad did. And his name is Jerry Holland. He became an admiral in the Navy. And Jerry lived right down the street from the Iowa base. And John Glenn personally recruited him for the bat boy job, but also the little mascot. And he would actually travel with the baseball team. And he told me he would dispense bubble gum. That was his official job. Now, of course, Gerald Ford was one of the athletic instructors in Chapel Hill. And if you look, there was a newspaper called the Cloudbuster, and there's an image there where you see Ford with some of his peers. And again, these are just some of the things that I extracted out of the archives in Chapel Hill when I wrote the book. And next one, George H.W. Bush. And now I'll note, there was, over the years, there was a rumor that he was with Ted Williams in Chapel Hill. That's actually not true. They were there 6 months apart. Bush came in 1942, in August of 42, and he left in October. And he was a star soccer player. Now, I'll tell you, had he shipped in that spring, he definitely would have been on the baseball team. And of course, baseball history may have been rewritten, a totally different chapter, but he was a star soccer player. And you'll see there was a write-up in the Cloudbuster paper where they faced Duke. Now, this was truly one of my most amazing discoveries. And I want to credit Laurie Miller, who has a research service at the archives in St. Louis. When I started digging around, I asked her to pull everything she could find on Ted Williams. And I got this box on my front porch. It was literally like a suitcase. And I started going through the files, and I looked and I saw this enlistment memo. And then I looked down and I see George Bush right there. So, you know, 2 huge living figures in history were right there all along on the same page. You know, early on, just a random, you know, a Navy memo. And then here's some other famous cadets, Ed McMahon and then Dennis Weaver. Now, Dennis, I know, was a track star, and I believe he trained on the St. Mary's campus. And of course, Ed became a decorated Marine combat pilot, very proud there. But again, he's with Johnny Carson, who I believe actually originally had intended to, he enlisted in the V5. For whatever reason, he was transferred to another program. But again, for all I know, they may have met there. So the next, here we get to the baseball. So again, my dad is a little boy. He's surrounded by, you know, many major league players. There's Ted Williams, Johnny Pesky, Harry Kraft, Buddy Hassett, Joe Coleman, John Sane. And I'm going to give you kind of a behind the scenes view of what it looked like. Now, the field there is really torn up. That's the old Emerson ball field because they played football there. They pretty much did everything and they just tore it to shreds. But again, these guys, you know, they were in truly one of the toughest physical training programs on earth. And then they form this baseball team. They get on these terrible tin can buses with no air conditioning, and they hit the road on Wednesday night and often on the weekends to play teams like the Durham Bulls. They played military teams. They played colleges in something called the Ration League against NC State, Duke, and of course Carolina. And my favorite part of this story, they played some of the factory teams from Burlington. Factory teams where people were building airplanes and munitions. And so again, it was just an all effort for the people. So again, they played factory teams, and I'm going to show you some of the publicity stills that were taken. So this is early on. I believe this was during indoctrination training, but you've got Charlie Gehringer there just posing with some major league players. And again, this is Kid Brewer. He was a Navy publicist at UNC who staged this photograph, which again was in the archives for about 75 years in Chapel Hill. Now, this is truly one of my very favorite images. Obviously, Johnny Pesky with Ted Williams. And with, I believe that's Dom DiMaggio. Anyway, they were just kind of together. They were reunited because, again, they played the military teams. And he had come down from Norfolk. That was their arch rival. And they just got some of these beautiful images captured. And when you look at Ted Williams, when he first arrived on campus, he wasn't very happy to be there. But here, about a month into training, he's happy. And of course, he's with Johnny Pesky, who was one of his big supporters. But again, it was a reunion of sorts when the Norfolk team would come down. And Eddie Robinson actually is alive. He's 99 years old. He'll be 100 in December, and he played on this team out of Norfolk. I believe it was Norfolk Naval Training Station. And he's told me, you know, took me back in the book and told me exactly what it was like to be out on the field and when they got to see each other again during the war. So again, it's just one of those famous reunions. And here's another picture. That's Buddy Hassett. He was first baseman for the New York Yankees with Johnny Pesky and Ted Williams again. And if you look behind them, that's the dugout that the baseball team actually built during the war.
And you could just the images alone.
I know.
Captivating beyond the story, you tell. And I think it's just all the more amazing, as you said, that the story has been kind of dormant, for so many years when you see how many famous people, were connected to it.
Right. This game, I believe, was the very first game where Ted Williams played. And I think there may have been about 4,000 people crammed into the stands here. But again, you see children, you see civilians from Chapel Hill. Again, this is really how we got through the war. These guys giving everything they had, not only for training to get behind the controls of warplanes, but just playing exhibition baseball for morale. And then this is a famous picture. Now, the gentleman, the boy in the long black pants is 87 years old. And I believe his name is Rennie Reynolds. I did a long story about him a couple months ago for the Raleigh News and Observer. And he told me, that was just one of the Navy publicity photos with Johnny and Ted. My dad is the little boy sitting down there. But I do think it's funny because these little boys, they never wore any clothes. They often went around barefooted without their shirts on because they're training during a heat wave. And that's really important. When I wrote the book, one of the last living players, he was alive and well. His name was Ivan Flesser. And I flew up to Michigan, and he, again, told me the story about how it was just absolutely brutally hot. And they would jump on these buses, and they were really excited. They're like, gee, I get to ride the bus today, and I get a bologna sandwich, But to them, again, it was an old school bus, but they got to rest. They may have been in the bus for an hour or two to play one of those games with some of the Bat Boys. But to them, that was a real luxury just because they were absolutely worn out from training. Now, this is another famous photograph. They allowed Ted to leave base. It was one of the first times he actually got to leave the state. This was in July of '43 when he appeared in the All-Star game. And there he is shaking hands with Babe Ruth. George Yankowski, who recently passed away at 98, told me that he was there. He had played for the Philadelphia Athletics, but he was standing right behind the photographer when this picture was taken. He said it was a sweltering hot day, and Babe Ruth was drinking beer out of a white pitcher, and he had just put it down before they snapped this image.
That sounds like Babe Ruth, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. So now here we go, the Yankeelands game. If you look, that baseball actually sold at an auction for just a couple $1,000 several years ago. But I've been able to collect things from this famous game. It was the Yankeelands game where Babe Ruth was brought in to manage a team of Yankees and Indians. And so that's how we know that the Cloudbusters truly were better than the New York Yankees. And I'm not going to give away the score of this game, but I actually have that game program courtesy of eBay. So again, this was in July of 1943 when the Navy pilots boarded one of those buses and they took an overnight trip to New York. And again, for guys like Buddy Hassett, he was going back to his home field, but they played a team really organized to raise money for war bonds, the American Red Cross, courtesy of Babe Ruth, who came on as the manager. Now, other things that went on at campus, Ted Williams was a champion boxer in Chapel Hill. And I have been told that he wanted to be treated like a regular Joe. And even the boxing coach, he saw this cadet just, delivering punches, was a really talented boxer. He had no idea that it was Ted Williams. And of course, this is a publicity image with Johnny Pesky. And you can see John Sane there to the side studying them. But again, Ted was a champion boxer at Chapel Hill. And other things. This was just a day in the life of Navy pre-flight. The gentleman there is Don George. He was the world wrestling champion. But you can imagine what people would think today if they saw this activity right outside of their dorm. But this was just, from what I understand, during some of the survival and hand-to-hand combat training, they had to learn to kill a man 12 different ways with their hands. And of course, you needed those skills. That came in handy if you were captured. So another thing, they hit the books there. The academics were pretty difficult. This, I believe, was from a theory of flight class. And from what I've ascertained, Ted Williams mastered physics, took a lot of courses that helped him understand, why a ball curved. And some of the players that I've interviewed, like Joe Grisinda, said he had all kinds of diagrams. But again, it explains, why an airplane lifts. And he mastered a lot of this during his time at Navy pre-flight. Again, it was just a 3-month program. But the daughter of his roommate, actually in Chapel Hill, she told me that her father was a really bright guy, and he tutored Ted in some of the physics. So again, I do know that he mastered, a lot of the academics there at Navy pre-flight, which he used for the rest of his life, obviously. And here you go. This is actually my all-time favorite image. Don Kepler's son gave this to me about 2 years ago. But I think it illustrates what life was like. There they are, just parked at a gas station. This was one of their probably overnight hikes. I was told by living cadets that they could hike, 40 miles. That was average. And another thing, and this is truly one of the craziest stories. Again, they're living cadets who told me they were moonshiners in the woods. And if any of these guys ever stumbled upon them in one of the overnight hikes, they said that the moonshiners would see them before they would see them, hiding in the bushes. And they usually had a shotgun. But what they were told to do, and this is actually in one of the manuals, was to walk up and stir the fire, just to show that they weren't going to turn them in. But again, they were everywhere around Chapel Hill. And this is just an illustration of, again, that brotherhood. It was like the Boy Scouts, just traveling together on the old buses during the war training. And then this is, again, one of my favorite. Ted Williams was loved the outdoors, as many followers know. And this is Don Kepler, who was a baseball coach, but he was also the head of the survival school. Now, he was also a bear hunter, and every year he shot a turkey, a deer, and a bear. And he would win a trophy for this up in Pennsylvania. He lived around on a farm up near Penn State, where he later became one of the baseball coaches. But you can see this. This is exactly what I'm talking about, that trustworthy brotherhood. Maybe he was definitely a mentor to Ted, but, he got him through this really tough period in his life when he had to pause his baseball career. Here he was, truly the most famous hitter who ever lived, especially in my opinion. But, they had each other's backs. And that's something I want to reinforce. There are 24 roughly major league players alive today who fought in World War II. And they tell me this. They said, it was just that time where we were all out there to support each other. And again, based on letters that I have, even from George Bush, they were just loyal to each other toward the end. But again, I think this is a beautiful image, and it just demonstrates that loyalty. Now, here's another one. This is Donald Kepler with Bear Bryant. And I got this image up at Penn State. But again, they would meet in the back of a coffee shop when Bryant would come up to Penn State, never say a word to anyone, but they would just enjoy coffee. And, it took them back to that time during World War II when they were just training together as young men before, Bear Bryant really became super, super famous. Now, again, they march in as boys, and you can obviously see this. The picture tells the story. It's all about Navy pre-flight. They ship in, of course, the baseball players that I talk about in my book. It was, May of 1943. And then 3 months later, they march out. And then I'm going to wrap up with one of my all-time favorite players who trained in Chapel Hill for the next slide. Of course, actually, right before that, that is my grandfather. I want to make a note. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1926. And that's the end of the war. And, very sadly, I never really knew my grandfather, but he was just a patriot, and he was a serious man. He was called back into the service in World War II. He was too old to fight. He was in his late 30s, but again, he was the commander of the Navy pre-flight station, I believe in 1944 to 1945. And obviously this is, an iconic image that I found in Chapel Hill at the end of the war. Now, Johnny Pesky, we've got a film clip. It's a real treat. And thanks to you guys, you had an event called When Baseball Went to War in 2007. And here is where Johnny Pesky literally tells us what you need to win a war, to get through COVID. If you want to become a major league player, this is what you got to have. And it's about a minute long, but hopefully you guys can watch this. I just love this. And he was in his late 80s when this was recorded at the World War II Museum.
Anything that you would want to say 50 years from now to future generation ball player or student of history?
Well, 50 years from now, I know I won't be here, but I'm going to go as long as I can. But I think baseball should stay just the same rules, same regulations. You're going to get good players, you're going to get mediocre players, you can get bad players. The bad players have to go somewhere else and get jobs. And you're a good player. Sometimes you get hurt, you can't play, you got to go find something else to do, especially if you're a family guy, and that's just the way it works.
You have any advice as a coach to any future players?
Well, no. When you're a player, you learn how to throw. You keep learning throwing. You throw. Instead of throwing for 5 minutes, you throw for 15 minutes, then from 15 to 20, and so forth. Same thing with the bat. Someone is there to see. You got to have strength in your bat. Some guys have what they call a long sleeve with no strength. But the good hitters, you watch them, they're like that. They grit their teeth, and boy, they're ready to hit the ball. And there's a lot of little things a guy can do to help himself. But strength within yourself is what you got to have.
What a great clip.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, and I had a chance to meet his son, David Pesky, who's just a great guy. But I saw that and I thought, that's really the answer. And I'll note my dad, after he had this Captain Marvel Bat Boy experience, he became an All-American pitcher at Carolina. He pitched for the Durham Bulls, and he was in the Detroit system for a few years. And he actually, Johnny Pesky was his manager in the Texas League. But, he told my dad this as a little boy. It's really, you can do this. It's the strength within yourself is what you've got to have to succeed. And that's really what the heart of the book is about.
Well, that's amazing. And it's such an incredible story. And so I think we should start transitioning here into Q&A, and already a few questions. And I thought I would just start out with one, though, just about the notion of America's pastime and how your book really does speak to that. And that, how do you see baseball as a kind of lens into culture and war? Because your book really does shed a lot of insight about this, something about this sport that it would even be called America's pastime. And in World War II, it was so important that Franklin Roosevelt in early 1942, the title actually of our webinar about it should be kept going. It really matters so much to America. We should keep it going, even though there are all these sacrifices, there are all these things that we're going to have to ration. The sport should not stop. And your book really does say a lot about how baseball, something about it throws light on, you know, about culture, our culture, about wartime sacrifice, about teamwork. What could you say about that, Ann?
Well, I actually get that question now more than ever because of these times that we live in. But, you know, baseball is really unchanged. It's one of those sports which is traditional. And I think this is really important. It unites the generations. And it's something that can be enjoyed by boys, girls, little kids, grandparents. You know, again, it's this all-American sport. And I think that it brings people together, and it's a national sport. I think it truly is our pastime. And I think now more than ever, people, they miss baseball. You know, it is popcorn and peanuts, and it's gathering on a hot summer afternoon with the sun on your shoulders. And these ball players, they are idols, you know, in their own right. I mean, they represent just heroism over the generations. And, you know, when we go back to World War II, you look at some of the most famous players who ever lived to pause their careers to fight for their country. But again, today, we obviously miss baseball. And I've interviewed gentlemen like Eddie Robinson, again, the oldest living major league player. And I've said, you know, what do you think of this? And he's like, of course, baseball will be back. And Vin Scully is another. I had an opportunity to speak with him, you know, at the beginning of the COVID epidemic or pandemic. And he's 93 years old. And he said, you know, it's like the pillar of our society. And he's upbeat, though. But again, he said, you know, the day the fever goes down is the day that the baseball fever begins. You know, we will find ourselves back in ballparks. And again, it just symbolizes truly America united.
You know, I think a lot of people, and when they look at your book, they're going to probably have some nostalgia. I mean, obviously the photos and the story that you tell, but I imagine many of them are going to think about, you know, sitting in front of a radio, you know, listening to games, or obviously sitting and watching a game on TV, or what you noted is just going to a game, you know, there and having a hot dog, having a beer, you know, and sitting there and watching in the 9 innings. And so I think for a lot of people, they're going to connect with this story in a very direct, emotional, and experiential way. And in fact, that leads me to ask our first question from an online viewer. I think you'll appreciate, and is from a Chapel Hill graduate, says "Go Heels."
Oh, good.
It's a question from Leah, and she asked, I'm wondering if there are any buildings or other markers from the World War II training base left on the UNC campus.
Well, that's a great question. Navy Hall is still there. And I believe it was built in 1943, and it was used as a publicity office and just one of the main offices for administration during the war. But the neat thing is, actually, I credit my mother for this. All the dorms are there where the players and the athletes lived. I actually graduated from the school, and, you know, I go back and if you walk the grounds, it's literally the same. Now, Emerson Field, the baseball field, obviously was torn down in the 1970s, but many of the training fields were there. There's a pool that actually has tiles in the shape of Navy anchors back behind Will and Jim. It's still there, and they train the pilots to swim. And obviously, being a pilot in the Pacific, that came in handy, especially if you crash down, you know, in the ocean or back of beyond islands and jungles. But again, a lot of the dorms are there. The classrooms are there, like Caldwell Hall, where I can tell you, you know, Ted Williams probably took a physics course. So that's the beauty of the school. Many of the dorms and the classrooms are there, and I hope they keep Navy Hall. And of course, the airport is still there. I believe it has been closed temporarily, or maybe closed forever. But again, most of the landmarks are there.
Oh, great. Well, this next question comes from Gary, and he asked if you could tell us some stories about your dad and how he carried his love of the game with him throughout his life?
Well, my poor father had two daughters, so he never had a son, I know. And so he never really took me to a baseball game, but he was a sports fanatic. I mean, obviously, you have to read the book to understand what happened to him. But he grew up, went to Haverford Boys School, was a baseball player, played varsity baseball all through high school. And then he went back to Chapel Hill to college because he loved it so much. Again, I believe he was the first All-American pitcher at Chapel Hill. And signed with the Durham Bulls right out of college. And then obviously he played with the Detroit system for a few years, but I will give you a hint, he did get hurt. And so when that happens to a person, and I've encountered a lot of former athletes who literally approach me after I do these talks in tears. And they'll say, you know, you've articulated how I felt. Because a lot of men, they don't talk about how they feel. Now, my father was just a jolly person. He had pretty much a photographic memory for stats. There were, you know, torn out scores and newspaper clips literally in the cushions of the chairs at our house. I mean, he lived and breathed for baseball. And he was that guy who walked around with the Sports Illustrated in his back pocket. You know, he savored that. And again, he read about it, he told stories. But I think the neat thing was he actually knew guys like Mickey Mantle. And he could say, yeah, I did strike him out in spring training. He at least made those memories, and he loved to regale and roll in it and tell those tales. But again, when he got hurt, I do know that it was really painful for him. And that probably is what led me to write this book, because I opened the trunk, I look at the scrapbooks, and it just validated how good he was. And I really mourned for him that he was injured and he wasn't able to achieve that dream.
What do you think, and when you, after, you know, looking at this story, you mentioned about, you know, when you discovered these items and it led to this huge, such a rich story, that one of the things we get here at the museum often are people talking about how fragile these stories are. And that, you know, that there's often so much there that's not told, and then you have to reconstruct it. And if you have any thoughts on that about it, you know, like if somebody doesn't discover these stories, they're just lost. You know, right. They're so amazing and there's so much there, but if they're not passed on, if they're not transmitted, or if there's nothing left there to reconstruct it, then they vanish. And right. You know, and I think one of the things about your book, because it has this personal element to it, it makes us think a lot about how fragile, obviously how fragile life is, but how fragile these stories are, and right. It's really up to people to piece them together and keep them alive.
Right. Well, I think it's really our responsibility. And I know just today, with so many differing opinions about things like monuments, I think that the key is just trying to do the best we can to preserve the past, because it's really our roadmap to history. A lot of things are going to be destroyed. Records will be destroyed. And I think, for example, that picture that hung on the wall of my parents' house, it's still there. It told a story. And I think we all have that. We all have that image of a grandparent. And I think that we do have that responsibility to probe. And we've got the internet, which is a wonderful, wonderful tool. You know, I was able to write this book because I had a great roadmap. I went to Chapel Hill and, you know, you do camp out for weeks, literally, with a pack of crackers, and you run outside and you sit back down, and it's exhaustive. But again, I think that we should just try to grab every scrap of information that we can, because truly, when you reconstruct the past, you can learn for the future. And that is a message I'd like to send, especially based on the interviews that I've done with the surviving major league players who knew Ted Williams and Johnny Pesky. And, you know, they all say we were united during World War II. We all had different thoughts about it, but we contributed and we did our part.
Thank you. Yeah, this kind of leads me to the next question we've got from our Facebook audience about how do some of these star baseball players reflect on their time in training and serving during the war? And did they have a sense about the caliber of the team they had assembled in Chapel Hill? Were they really aware of like how good this is at the time?
Well, I'm so glad someone asked that question, because, you know, again, when we write this history, I urge people to jump on an airplane, to spend that money and look at someone in the eye and get them to tell you the story. So I tracked down Ivan Flesser, who was the pitcher for the team. And the funny thing, his daughter Debbie told me that he never really told her the story until she went off to college. And it was sort of like, oh, by the way, I pitched for a team and I played with Ted Williams. And so, going back to that, these people who survived from the era, they can take you back in time. And Ivan told me that they were a decent team early on in the season, but he said that the coach pulled him off to the side. He goes, listen, some really good players are going to come in a few days. He didn't tell them who they were, but he was one of the first guys who actually was alerted, because everything was classified. It was really secret. They didn't publicize it when they landed on campus. I mean, so he was one of the first to know. But yeah, it was literally overnight when these guys went from a fairly average team with some great college players, maybe a couple minor leaguers, maybe 1 or 2 major leaguers, to having 9 or 10 major league players. And, that makes a big difference. So did they know? Yeah. I mean, and they would go to different bases too. So, and they would encounter each other again, like, in Indiana or Pensacola or Corpus Christi. So, they played for various teams as they went along their way in training.
That's fascinating. And we had, in fact, leads me to the next question there about this, how this took shape. We had a question about recruiting, like how the Navy recruited, like what kinds of tools did it use to want to pull people into this program, especially with so many famous people connected to it?
Well, radio obviously was big, and but again, they needed pilots, and this program, being one of the toughest, most dangerous paths in the military with the most casualties, was a magnet for major league players. And again, they had, as you could see from the slides and some of the cartoons and the illustrations, they had really talented artists who went to work on beautiful, beautiful posters, which the museum has done such a wonderful job of preserving. They had commercials, and they actually had a documentary training film, which I was able to access up at the National Archives, of a recruiting film, where they would show your average guy, and when he just decides to become a pilot, and they would shadow him. And, they would show people what it was like to train, from beginning to end until he earned his wings. And so, again, it was similar to what we have today. Obviously, we didn't have social media, but it was newspaper, magazine. And of course, at the very beginning, that picture of my dad with Johnny Pesky and Ted Williams, that right there was military recruiting. I know for a fact that they probably practiced that pose 3 or 4 times, but they really put star celebrity athletes through the drills to capture these images. But I want to make one extra point. There are people who are in their 80s and 90s to this day. They come up to me in tears and they'll say, oh, I was living in Greensboro, and my dad and I rode a bicycle over to the ballpark, and I got a baseball signed by Ted Williams. And so, all part of that was just, they were the good guys, and they spent their time posing for publicity images, but they also waited out into the stands after these games, and they spent the time to autograph those balls. And, again, so it was all just portraying the good guys. And obviously they wrote newspaper articles about them and followed them with the media, but it was controlled press, if you will. But again, they were really symbols of our all-American heroes. And indeed, in their own special way, they did help us win the war.
And I can only imagine there was a huge amount. You just noted this about people recalling their stories of meeting Ted Williams or others here. There must have been a huge amount of fan mail, of letters written by people, like fans of the teams, etc. Anything you'd like to share that you've come across about the fans' response to, Ted Williams and others during the war?
Well, I think when I was in Falmouth up at Cape Cod, a gentleman came. He had been Ted Williams' bat boy, and he comes with this big bag of things that he had signed. And, obviously he was a huge fan, but, there are survivors who have come to me. And after you write a book, by the way, you get lots of emails, which I love. And, they might say, I was 8 years old and this changed my life. But again, I think that these guys, they would have received fan mail, but the mail was closely monitored in Chapel Hill. And again, these guys, I want to reinforce, they were training, 12 hours a day, sometimes out in the hot sun. And so the Navy monitored that very closely about what they received. And actually, for all I know, they may have gotten a big box of mail when they left to go to the next station. But again, they were just living, breathing Captain Marvels, the heroes of their generation. And to this day, as a matter of fact, I spoke with Carl Erskine, who was a pitcher for the Dodgers. He's 93 years old, lives in Anderson, Indiana. He's told me that his fan mail, he had served in the Navy, has increased 5-fold during COVID. So again, to me, what that tells us is that people more than ever, they gravitate toward this. They need this. They want to remember these heroes from our past who served their country, well-intentioned. And, again, they were just models for society.
Well, that's great. And I thought maybe we'd wrap up just by asking you, obviously this is a tremendous story and the book is already generating so much interest. Is this something you want to keep working on? Do you have like a next step, a next phase, or is there something that you'd still like to kind of look at more that the book has opened you up to? What's next?
Well, yeah, one thing I've done, I wish I could be with players face to face. COVID has been a challenge because when I interview people, I like to sit in the room, look them in the eye. For about 2 years, I've been recording conversations with surviving Major League players who served in World War II. I think it'd be actually a great conversation to have here. But I wanted to extract, advice on how they got through the war and what they would tell us to do to, get through these difficult times. And so, that is a natural next step. If you go to my website, you can read about some of the conversations I've had. I just interviewed Tim Thompson, who was a catcher for the Tigers, the Athletics, and one other in the Dodgers. And he was also a blimp pilot. So, and he was head of the athletics department at Moffett Field out in California. And then he became a famous scout. But I say that he was a scout for about 40 years, but he made an effort to look at the players that nobody else would see. And that's something that I want to stress is they wanted to give everyone a fair chance. And, again, I will continue to write about these narratives. But again, it's more just to extract how they got through the war, what advice they would give us. And, again, these gentlemen are in their mid to late 90s. And I just think that's a real gem. There have been books written about some of the World War I players, and a lot of different stories about World War II. But again, my next work might be a portrayal of just the last survivors from that generation.
Well, that sounds so interesting. Well, Anne, let me thank you very much for sharing this research with us. And let me encourage our audience to go out and check out Anne Keene's book, The Cloudbuster 9, The Untold Story of Ted Williams and the Baseball Team That Helped Win World War II. Thanks everyone out there for joining us today in this conversation. And hopefully we can all look forward to some baseball, a hot dog, a cold beer, and a good game very soon. But thank you very much, Anne.
Thank you. It was a real privilege and an honor to be here. Thank you so much.